Hey everybody, welcome back to Law, Politics, and Society. This week we're going to be talking about racial minorities and the effect the legal system has had on either perpetuating discrimination or eradicating it. So I hope you enjoy the material this week. Let's get started. So the United States has been sort of bedeviled by race and race relations almost from the moment the first European settlers landed in what they called the New World. Race relations were virtually assured to be contentious because you had one group who initially attempted to dominate the existing indigenous population. And so this would require continual actions of law and the legal system to try and keep the sort of occupiers at the time from exerting the full force of their power. The United Nations Declaration on Minorities insists that the right of minorities only exist within a framework of democracy. And so by its very nature, democracy is responsible for the will of the people and to uphold the greatest good for the greatest number, right? It's a utilitarian framework. It's very Kantian. And so independent judiciaries can and should step in and apply the rules of law. And that should be to protect the interests of everybody. But courts can only go so far if they're not supported by the other branches of government, mainly the legislature and the executive. And we have seen countless examples of this. And we're going to start with Black America and the race relations between Blacks and whites, largely, through slavery. So slavery really is as old as human history. It has existed since antiquity, and it has always been abhorrent. It's never been, anything other than awful. And the conception of American slavery really evolved from the English practice of indentured servitude. And so indentured servitude was really sort of an employer-employee relationship, but think of it more as master and servant. Usually there was a certain number of time, typically 7 years, that indentured servants were kept and then could be released if they had done everything they were supposed to have done, and then given acres of land, usually about 50, to start their own businesses. But typically indentured servants in the Old World in England were white. This started to change in America, and we'll talk about this on the next slide. So the American Constitution and the Declaration of Independence appear to contain some law and language outlawing slavery. So all men are created equal, for example, looks like that means that it literally means all men. Some claim that Somerset v. Stewart in 1772 should have been followed. That was a case where all of the slaves could have been freed because the precedent had been made a part of American common law. But on the other hand, Article 1, Section 9 really affirms the right of the southern states to import or allow migration for such persons as the states think that they shall exist. And Article 1, Section 2 refers to free persons and 3/5 of other persons. So it's clear that there is some contradictory language. One of the, I think, most interesting cases is the Amistad case. You may have seen the film from 1997. So the Amistad case was about a ship. The ship was called Amistad. It was a Spanish ship, and it held African slaves that were being transported to Cuba. And they revolted and killed all but two of the people who had captured them, and they wanted to go back to Africa. So they kept 2 of their captors so that they could go back to Africa. Instead, the navigators took them to New York. The Amistad lands in New York. The remaining Africans were captured, and there was a federal district court who got involved to determine what was going to happen. And so the defendants were represented by former President John Quincy Adams. They argued for their freedom on the basis of natural legal principles that were found in the Declaration of Independence. The court released the slaves on Adams's argument and ordered them to be released and returned to Africa. But this case really exacerbated slave and non-slave state tensions and bitter feelings between the South and the North. And this case was used in a lot of propaganda in the run-up to the Civil War. A case that really had the opposite effect of the Amistad case was the Dred Scott case. And this was officially called Scott v. Stanford from 1857. And Dred Scott was a man born into slavery in Missouri. And under the Missouri Compromise of 1820, Missouri was the only slave state that was allowed to be formed in the territory gained by the Louisiana Purchase. So Scott was sold and eventually moved to Illinois and then to free Wisconsin territory. And after he returned to St. Louis, he petitioned for his freedom based on the fact that he had lived in free territory. And initially, there were a lot of very specific rulings about whether or not this case could determine living in free states could grant freedom. The district court in Missouri initially gave Scott his freedom in 1850, but there was an appeal to the Missouri Supreme Court where the legal climate was not particularly friendly, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court at this point, Roger Taney, was very pro-slavery, and it was very clear from the outset that he was going to try and pull the judges to his stance. And so the court ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, that under Article 3, no Black person, even if free, could be a citizen of the United States. And so Dred Scott had no standing to sue in federal court because essentially he wasn't a citizen, even though he had been brought to America and had lived in America. And so this framework sort of laid the groundwork for the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which had opened up areas of the West to slavery. This was a precursor to legalizing slavery throughout the United States. It was seen as a mechanism to open up slavery to the North, and the court put their stamp of approval on slavery. And this is what led to Bleeding Kansas and sort of the mini Civil War that turned into a much larger Civil War beginning in 1861. Okay, so in the run-up to the American Civil War, slavery was a major factor. The southern states were very angry at their perception that they were going to lose what they thought was their most important economic assets, and that the loss of slavery would essentially bankrupt them. And so you had several states secede in the South, and the American Civil War was fought to preserve the Union. The North did not believe that secession was legal or constitutional, or that the South had any right to secede. So slavery was a major part of leading up to this, but is not the reason the North ended up fighting the South over the Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation, one of the most famous speeches by Abraham Lincoln in 1862, freed all slaves in the rebellion. All states in rebellion. So every state that had seceded now no longer had any slaves. All of the slaves had been freed. And after the Civil War ended in 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which banned slavery both in the United States and any territories that the United States held. And so in the Reconstruction era, Blacks fared better in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. Initially, there were federal government supports to help emancipated slaves and to make sure that they were protected. This was called the Freedmen's Bureau. It supplied former slaves with food and clothing and schools and land. Juries could have Blacks on them for the first time. Blacks could hold office, and desegregation was fairly normal. This seemed to be the way that post-Civil War America was going to integrate. But unfortunately, that's not how this turned out. In response, Southern jurisdictions passed what were called Black Codes. And this was an effort to attempt to recreate slavery under new legal frameworks. And they were passed under the assumption that freed slaves would not work unless they were forced to. And so they restricted and controlled and inhibited the movements and behaviors of ex-slaves almost completely. They authorized local authorities to arrest unemployed blacks and fine them for vagrancy, and they struck down numerous laws that had been helped to create and foster integration in the South. But Black Codes were deemed unconstitutional when the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868. The 15th Amendment, which was passed in 1870, granted suffrage to African American males for the first time, allowing them to vote. And so it seemed like, okay, maybe we'd gone through a rocky period post-Civil War, but perhaps things were going to change for the better. And that's not what happened. What we got instead was the emergence of Jim Crow laws, which were collections of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation. And the philosophical underpinnings of Jim Crow laws was racism. It was absolutely believed that there were no forms of equality between blacks and whites. And so, following the legalization of Jim Crow laws, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which meant that all persons were entitled to full access and enjoyment of all accommodations and facilities in public places. And this resulted in several civil rights cases beginning in 1883. And what we saw was really a reversal. It allowed private entities and individuals to continue to discriminate. And the civil rights cases actually ruled that the first Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional because it sought to control the legislative power of the individual states, violating the 10th Amendment, which was a separation of the federal government and the state governments. So following this decision, Southern states began enacting sweeping segregation legislation to disenfranchise Black Americans. And by the 1890s, virtually all forms of integration had disappeared in the South. So it was within this climate that we get Plessy v. Ferguson, which was one of the most important cases in the Reconstruction era. So prior to that decision, Louisiana had passed a statute decreeing all railroad companies must provide separate but equal accommodations. And it was very clear that the white accommodations were significantly better than the Black accommodations on the trains. The Blacks were at the very back of the trains. They had much sparser furnishings. They didn't have as many carriages, so they were more cramped. And the Comité des Citoyens, which is the Citizens Committee, decided to test the Louisiana statute for constitutionality in 1892, and they nominated Homer Plessy to sit in a whites-only railroad car, and to inform the conductor that, according to Louisiana, he was indeed colored. And, of course, he was arrested. He was 7/8 white and physically indistinguishable from a white person, but it didn't matter because you either were pure white or you were non-white. There was no gray area. And so Plessy was arrested and he was found guilty, eventually appealed his case all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1898, we get Plessy v. Ferguson. And so the goal of this case was to address the reasonableness of the Louisiana statute. And what the court held was that separate but equal laws were in fact constitutional. And this is really a black mark on U.S. history because it placed a stamp of approval on the state's effort to deny social and political rights to Black Americans. They said that separate but equal laws did not violate the 14th Amendment. They did not impact the legal equality of the races. And this was fairly surprising. It was eventually overturned, but it took a very long time before that happened. And in the same year, we got Mississippi v. Williams in 1898, where the courts again upheld disenfranchisement. And it was at this point that Black leaders had radically different ideas about how Black America should respond. and we get two very divergent camps. We get Booker T. Washington and we get W.E.B. Du Bois, and I'm going to talk about those on the next slide. So Booker T. Washington believed that Black, quote-unquote, deficiencies were responsible for Black conditions, and that they should try and appease whites by keeping their distance and engaging in hard work. He really believed that whites were not going to come around to Black Americans until Blacks had engaged in hard work for long periods of time. And this was sort of applauded by whites as a recognition of the lesser than-ness of Blacks. W.E. Du Bois was the exact opposite. He believed that Black Americans should aspire to higher education. They should not be content with manual work. They should agitate for the restoration of their rights. And he founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, with the help of progressive whites in 1910 to try and achieve these goals. And at the time, their most pressing issue was lynching. Between 1892 and 1968, more than 4,700 persons were lynched in America. Almost all of them were in the South, and over 70% of them were Black. And so this was a significant threat that Blacks faced. And many of these lynchings were organized or undertaken by the KKK or individuals who were sympathetic to their cause. So after World War I, many returning African-American soldiers, along with the power of the NAACP, fought against lynching, and this resulted in backlash and revival of the KKK. And we see an increase in lynching from 36 in 1917 during World War I to 76 in 1919, just after the war had ended. So we're almost doubling here. Many states had lynching laws, but they were unenforced. The federal government had no policy on lynching, and so there wasn't really anything for them to do. And the federal government did not pass an anti-lynching law until the Civil Rights Act of 1968. In 1981, two white men were convicted of lynching of an African-American man. This was a major case and got a lot of publicity. The victim was a man named Michael Donald, who was chosen at random because white men were very angry that a jury had failed to convict a Black man for the murder of a white police officer. This really started to signal the decline of the KKK and some white nationalist movements, although that started up again. And one of the two men that were convicted was the first white man since 1913, to be executed for murdering a Black man. World War II really marked the end of Jim Crow segregation, and what we began to see was a change in the Supreme Court and its makeup and its decision-making. And one of the first cases that we really started to see a change in was Smith v. Allwright in 1944. So in this case, there had been a white primary in the South, and it had been justified by the Democratic Party to be sort of a volunteer organization. And what the Supreme Court said was that you cannot have all white primaries or all white voting systems. And the court said that having those systems violated the 15th Amendment because primaries were always conducted under state authority. So this was a very big decision, and it really paved the way for Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which is the case that most people are familiar with. This is the case that required the school system in the South become integrated. And this process really didn't happen very quickly, and desegregation didn't happen at all until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were the first time that we had abolished things like poll taxes or literacy tests or attempts to pressure or intimidate Black Americans exercising their rights to vote. And so we really had a lot of congressional changes in the 60s under Lyndon Johnson, who really pushed for more integration, more desegregation. And both the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were challenged. The Civil Rights Act was challenged in Heart of Atlanta Motel, but the Civil Rights Act was upheld, and it was the Voting Rights Act was challenged in South Carolina v. Kurtzenbach, but again, it was upheld. And so we started to see the courts saying, no, we are not going to go back into a time of segregation. We are going to integrate. And one of the reasons Congress was really pushing for this was because of the Cold War. So during this period, the United States and the USSR were in a battle of minds and of wills. And the US feared that the Russians would exploit the quote-unquote Negro problem in the United States. There was a lot of propaganda that was being used. The United States and the Soviet Union were entirely competing for hearts and minds, as it were. And the treatment of African Americans was really a black mark that the USSR could try and push and expose. It was a powerful weapon for the Soviet Union in propaganda. So this led to the government beginning to file briefs in civil rights cases that supported civil rights because they didn't want the image of the United States in the international community to be tarnished. And so it was really the Cold War that put pressure on the United States government to clean up its act at home. So another group that has faced a very troubling history with regard to their treatment by whites is American Indians. And so the United States practiced physical and cultural genocide as official policy. There have been numerous accounts of scalping, cash bounties, having the desire to eliminate or colonize or desavage the entire Indian population. The Proclamation Act of 1763 was supposed to protect Indians. It prohibited any further white settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains and proclaimed that any land purchases from Indians without a representative of the royal government would be illegal. So this essentially led to a sort of patriarchal British government taking over the responsibilities. But unfortunately, this did not really help or protect Indians for long because of the War of Independence. And so in 1787, the Continental Congress passed what was called the Northwest Ordinance, which provided for a survey of the lands, particularly in the Great Lakes area, and to look where further settlement was going to be likely. And so there was a promise to act in good faith, but all of the territories that were being investigated for settlement should have been off limits based on the Proclamation Act. And then the U.S. Constitution granted Indigenous Americans quasi-independence. They had some degree of sovereignty. They could regulate commerce, but not have all of their constitutional powers. The Treaty of Fort Pitt did recognize their sovereignty. It was the first of about 350 treaties that were made that implicitly recognized the sovereignty of the indigenous population. But the status began to change very quickly as the United States decided that its most important desire was to expand and to move westward. In 1823, we get the Discovery Doctrine, and this was the superiority or the belief of the superiority of whites over the indigenous population and indigenous land. And so the Discovery Doctrine really claimed that Europeans could discover an area, and once they discovered it, they would have sovereignty over it, regardless of who was there first. And that meant that they would have an exclusive right to extinguish Indigenous occupancy. And this was held to be constitutional in Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823. Further, a few years later in Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, we see that really the Cherokees were seen as becoming virtually undistinguishable from whites. They had a written constitution, they owned black slaves, they had really assimilated, but their land had been annexed and taken from them essentially by Georgia. And the court ruled that they didn't have control of their lands, and they couldn't approach the federal court as a court of original jurisdiction because it was not a sovereign political entity. And they got some rights back in Georgia the next year because in Worcester v. Georgia, the federal government said it had the authority over Indian affairs, not states, and so Georgia was wrong to say that the Indigenous population did not have control over their affairs. But Georgia's encroachment on Cherokee lands continued without federal interference. Nobody really stopped it. The federal government had said that the courts could make whatever decision they wanted, essentially, but as we know, courts have very limited enforcement mechanisms. So if it wasn't enforced, it didn't mean more than the paper it was written on, essentially. And so we continue to see a deterioration of white Indigenous relations. In the 1930s, we get the Indian Removal Act. And under this act, Indigenous Americans from all over the Southeast were rounded up and marched at gunpoint to Oklahoma, or what was called Indian Territory. And this long walk and the series of long marches and walks became known as the Trail of Tears. And this led to the movement of Indigenous populations and the essential ghettoization of Indigenous populations onto reserve land. Prior to the Indian Removal Act, the Dakota Sioux and Oklahoma had been expelled from their 35 million acres a little bit east of the Mississippi River in exchange for promises of later payment, where they would be moved to Oklahoma. But of course, the money for payment never came. The Sioux were subsequently moved to Nebraska, and then they were eventually removed to Oklahoma. And they were treated with abject cruelty and complete disdain. And this chain of events led to a number of cases where a tribe member called Standing Bear left the reservation. The officials said that he had left illegally. At this point, the Indigenous population were not allowed to leave reserve land without fear of being arrested. And so in Standing Bear v. Crook in 1879, the court had to decide whether or not Indians had the right to leave reservations and whether or not Indians were actually persons. And so the court eventually asserted that Standing Bear was both a person and that they did have rights to leave reservations. And so this elevated the status of Indigenous people a little bit. It did not make them equal to whites, but it at least gave them some recognition over their own autonomy. In the 1870s, we also had the termination of treaty making and treaties that had previously existed, which really rendered Indigenous people as wards of the state. There was this belief that Congress could just abolish treaties that had previously existed and prohibit the further creation of treaties. And this led to the Cherokee tobacco case And what happened was the federal government's right to tax Cherokee tobacco sales was upheld. And this era became known as what was called the assimilation period. The assimilation period lasted until 1934. And this is where the U.S. changed its approach to the indigenous population and began to believe that indigenous people needed to be Christianized and civilized. And so the Bureau of Indian Affairs was first established to govern Indian life, providing food, running schools, eliminating heathen or godliness, and requiring conversion to Christianity. There were two sort of big cases that happened in the late 1880s. We get Ex parte Crow Dog, and we get United States v. Kagama in 1886. This looked at the original jurisdiction for criminal offenses, who is going to have responsible for criminal prosecutions. And so Congress passed the Major Crimes Act of 1885 because Crow Dog had been charged with the slaying of another Indian in Indian County, and it created federal jurisdiction. And this was upheld in United States v. Kagama. And so this meant that reservation land was still going to be subject to the federal government's criminal jurisdiction. Okay, we're going to move into talking about Asian Americans. Chinese and Japanese are the largest groups of Asian Americans in the United States. They came over first and suffered a great deal of prejudice and discrimination across the Western United States initially. They were subject to special taxes, often referred to as head taxes. They were barred from citizenship or holding land. And they were often beaten and driven out of towns that they lived in, and so immense cruelty. The Chinese typically came over voluntarily to work and to gain land. They became targets of legal and extra-legal harassment upon arrival almost instantaneously and were subject to stereotypes. Their labor was used during the gold rush when they first started coming in 1848, and subsequently again in the quest to build the railroad from east to west. But the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 passed, even though there had been a ruling very similarly that had decided that European exclusion acts were unconstitutional. But the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was ruled to be constitutional, and it was in place until it was repealed by Congress in 1943. Some states granted naturalized citizenship to the Chinese. It depended on the state. But in Re-Ayip in 1878, a California circuit court ruled that only individuals of European or African origin were eligible to become citizens. And this led to a series of important cases about Asians and Asian citizenship in the United States. In the United States v. Wong Kim Ark in 1898, the government was given a very firm ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court that it could not deny citizenship to anyone who had been born in the United States. So under the 14th Amendment, birthright citizenship was created, and the government could not strip citizenship to anyone born in the United States. And this was a huge ruling, but it didn't mean that foreign-born citizens could automatically become naturalized citizens. In Ozawa v. the United States in 1922, the court explicitly said that they could not, that any foreign-born Asians could not become citizens. So if you were born in the United States, yes, you would be a citizen, but if you were born abroad, you would never be able to be a citizen. Asian Americans were allowed greater levels of assimilation than African Americans. They were allowed into integrated schools much earlier, but we see again horrific acts of discrimination, and the largest one was perpetrated in 1942 under Executive Order 9066, which authorized the evacuation and relocation of all people of Japanese ancestry as a response to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And this was justified as a military necessity and led to Japanese Americans being rounded up and labeled as enemy aliens. In Korematsu v. United States, the court ruled that Japanese internment in camps was constitutionally suspect, but that it was ultimately justified because the circumstances of wartime that created emergency and peril outweighed individual rights, and that the security and government national interest outweighed the individuals being forced to live under harsh conditions. And this stain on American history lasted until 1983, when Korematsu's original indictment was voided and the conviction was reversed. The struggle to get compensated for the obvious illegal and abhorrent detainments happened in 1988, where the U.S. government awarded tax-free payments of $20,000 to each person that had been detained in internment camps, and there was also a formal government apology. Hispanic Americans have been the largest majority group in the United States for quite some time, and have been what has been called a silent minority until fairly recently. They've not had the same level of civil rights cases or protests or marches that have been associated with Black America, for example. But there are some important cases. In Ricardo Rodriguez in 1897, the whiteness of Hispanics was determined. Hispanics were declared white and were granted citizenship and voting rights, which put an end to any disenfranchisement efforts. The Hispanic classification were the first group to be granted citizenship because they were classified as white. And the origins of civil rights concerns really began with the Mexican-American War in 1846, which lasted till 1848. And the primary cause of admittance was that Texas was admitted to the United States in 1845. And so with that came a huge influx of Hispanic, previously Mexican individuals who are now living in U.S. territory. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in just at the end of the Mexican-American War gave over 500,000 square miles of territory to the United States. And this made up present-day Texas, Arizona, California, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, parts of Colorado, Kansas, and Wyoming. So this was a huge piece of land that was acquired by the U.S. under the treaty and subsequently purchased. The United States compensated Mexico about $18 million, which is worth about $550 million in today's money. And so with that, obviously, you're getting a large number of people who previously identified as Mexican now being in the United States. So even though Hispanic Americans got citizenship faster than any other minority group, they still had their share of discriminatory treatment. Many homesteaders on disputed lands were evicted without any compensation for the improvements they had made. And the United States really has a long history of welcoming Hispanics at one time and then expelling them at another, bringing them in, kicking them out, bringing them in, kicking them out. This was true in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, as Mexican Americans were employed by large agricultural enterprises in Southern California. They were needed as cheap laborers to help the economy. And the Mexican Revolution of 1910, combined with large abject poverty in the Mexican border regions, resulted in more than 500,000 refugees crossing the border into America and bringing with them significant amounts of cheap labor. And this was welcomed until the Great Depression. And during the Great Depression, state governments passed legislation barring the employment of aliens or non-citizens on any projects that were funded by the government. And this was done because so many white Americans were out of work and unemployed or underemployed, that it was seen that the priority for work had to go to white Americans. In 1942, the BRACO program was created that called for implementing temporary contract laborers from Mexico during severe labor shortages. So they recruited very specific types of individuals, mainly very fit individuals who would be able to work very long hours and could save the crops that were rotting in the fields due to lack of workers. Even though there were strict qualifications, many people who didn't qualify came anyway. And it caused the Mexican military to be deployed along the border because Mexico wanted to stem the tide of illegal emigration. They didn't want everybody to be able to leave, and they made it a crime to emigrate to the United States. And if you were caught, you could face 2 to 5 years of imprisonment if you left without proper authorization. So in 1954, we get Operation Wetback, which was a cooperative American-Mexican effort to stem the tide of illegal immigrants, because again, the Mexican economy was suffering serious losses due to lack of workers. And so about 1 million undocumented workers were rounded up in the United States and deported back to Mexico, either on ships in American ports or through the California border. Once back in Mexico, many of the deportees were forcibly removed from their original homes and communities and moved into the interior to work. Many were submitted to forced labor. And to save their Mexican workers, many American employers went through the process of legalizing them via the BRACO program, which eventually was curtailed in 1964. When it comes to segregation, we see school segregation occur much earlier for Hispanics. It happens in 1946 and 1947, which was heard 7 years before Brown v. Board of Education, where we would get some integration for Black folks. The court ruled initially that segregation of Mexican Americans was valid because the law didn't authorize it. It was something that had happened naturally. And so the initial ruling was that the case was a sort of de facto practice. Segregation happened naturally, but it wasn't an official legal principle, and so it couldn't be constitutional or otherwise. In White v. Register in 1973, the court ruled that legislative districts within each state must reflect the population demographics and not pre-existing boundaries if they were the result of gerrymandering. So what had been happening were many Hispanics had been put together and essentially redistricted so that all of the Hispanic folks in Texas in one area would go to one county and their share of the vote would be made smaller and divided up. And the court was very grumpy at the attempt to gerrymander. Although gerrymandering is still something that continues, and we're still fighting gerrymandering decisions to this day. In Hernandez v. Texas in 1954, the court ruled that the 14th Amendment extended rights to all racial and ethnic groups. So that should have eliminated all discrimination. But of course, prejudice and discrimination are often things that are insidious. Even if they're not authorized by laws, sometimes they continue to happen anyway. Beginning in the early 1980s, the Mexican government began to encourage citizens to migrate to the United States. So they really changed their stance. Instead of trying to prevent people from going, they encouraged them to go. And they said, send your money back home. That way you can support your families. And so since then, the United States has seen a massive influx of immigrants, both legal and illegal, from Mexico since that time. Although illegal immigration really peaked in the early 2000s, there's a huge waiting list to come to the United States legally. Currently, it's not just individual citizens that seek vested interest in the United States, but the actual Mexican government has been printing migrant guides instructing nationals on how to enter without detection. That was happening throughout the early 2000s, but was curtailed in just before 2007 in some governmental negotiations. And not surprisingly, the United States government was not very happy with Mexico printing out these migrant guides. In response to the huge influx of migrant populations, California passed Proposition 187 in 1994, which was called the Save Our State Initiative. It prohibited illegal aliens from obtaining social services and attempted to really make a differentiation between legal and non-legal Americans, particularly singling out Hispanic Americans and Hispanic immigrants more generally. And a federal judge ruled it unconstitutional. The Hispanic civil rights organizations were much later in forming, and they haven't had the same sort of degree of success that the Black civil rights organizations have had, but they are now fairly vocal and are working to gain more civil and political rights, particularly for individuals who are undocumented. So where are we at now? Well, racial, civil, political, and social equality for all groups is a fact enshrined by the law of the United States, but is often something that does not happen in practice. There has been an increase in reactionary activists since probably the initial election of President Barack Obama in 2008, which has gained more popularity in recent years. Unfortunately, hate crimes and crimes of racial bias have been on the rise. But overall, African Americans as well as Native Americans have made great strides in the quest for equality. There have been cases that have legitimized Indigenous land rights, recognized treaty rights, recognized self-governance, although, of course, they are still less sovereign than before Europeans came to America to take the land. Compared to other groups, Asian Americans today have less political muscle, although that's starting to change. And the affirmative action Harvard case I had you read about this week is really an example of Asian Americans beginning to activate their political voice. Despite their lack in numbers, Asian Americans really went from being loathed and excluded to what is often referred to as a model minority, or a group that the rest of the United States immigrants should look up to in terms of their success at assimilation. It's been really too early to assess the progress of Hispanics in the United States because they still are targets of discrimination as labor needs change. Right now, there's been a very strong line on illegal immigration under the Trump administration, and he has talked frequently about closing the border, particularly to stem what he believes is an unquenchable flow of migrants to the United States, even though the rate is still much lower than it was in the early 2000s. And so it's a moving target. We've had some successes, but we still have a long way to go. This week, I'm having you watch some documentaries on some of the discrimination that is still occurring in the United States. And so I do want to recognize the progress that has been made, but I also think we need to talk about where we still have yet to go. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts this week, and I'll talk to you soon.